virology or virology, however you want to pronounce it, is the study of viruses, okay? And viruses are really, would somebody close that door over there? Okay, so virology is a study of viruses, and viruses is really something that we've kind of learned about more recently, as far as Earth's history is concerned. It was only back in the 1800s where we started even thinking that there was something like that about viruses. There were a couple scientists that did some work with things that we know today were caused by viruses, but they didn't really know they were viruses. But a guy by the name of Iwanowski is the person who actually worked with the tobacco mosaic virus. That's TMV. And this is a picture of tobacco leaves. Okay, in the South they grow a lot of tobacco. Where we lived in the Kansas City area, they grew tobacco there, and even would sell their tobacco leaves. Okay, now this blotchy stuff that's on the leaves is actually caused by a virus. It's caused by a virus, but he is the only one he just identified about what was going on there. But as far as what actually was the virus or what was actually causing that, a guy by the name of Stanley did his work in the 1930s, and he actually isolated the virus. So if you have isolated the virus, I think in your book it says he used a huge quantity of tobacco leaves that were infected like this, and probably chopped them all up, just made them into a mush, and put water in there, and then filtered out the water, and filtered the water, and then evaporated the water, and what was left behind was a tiny quantity of this virus. They look like crystals, is what they actually look like. Now, here's the question that's been asked for a long time. Are viruses alive? Do they meet our definition of living organisms? Now, do you remember way back at the beginning of the year, we talked about things that all living things have to have, or they are capable of doing? What are some of those? You could just name whatever one you're thinking of. If it's a living organism, it usually can do what? Or needs what? Okay, needs food. What else? What else does it need, Jake? Okay, from the food, it's going to need energy. All living things need energy. Okay? They need water, usually, because all the cells need water inside of them to do that. They need what? Like you need, if I don't give you this, you probably would die. Besides water? What? Yeah, we already have food. Oxygen, there we go. Oxygen. Okay? Is that what you're going to say? Okay, oxygen. They can grow, remember? And they die, and we had a whole list of things they can do. Well, viruses don't seem to do all of those. So, is virus actually just a chemical that if we're exposed to it and it's making us sick? Or are they real organisms? Is this just a kind of organism, and our definition for life is a little bit too narrow, maybe? Or are viruses really alive? Maybe they're not really alive. So those are the kind of questions you have about viruses, because they don't fit our classic definition of all the other living organisms that are part of of all the different kingdoms that we've talked about. So here is a drawing of one kind of virus. They don't all look like this, but this is one kind of virus. This happens to be a virus that attacks bacteria. So, you're kind of thinking, what can attack a bacteria and kill it? Well, viruses can do that. And this one is called a bacteriophage, which means it attacks bacteria. Now, it's microscopic. We didn't even know what a virus looked like until we got some electron microscopes to be able to, and there's a picture in your book, but there's actually a lot better pictures of this virus now with electron microscope. The parts of a virus, it has two main parts. Okay, it has this core inside of this, which looks like the head end. There is some genetic material inside of there. We call it nucleic acid. Remember, that can be RNA or DNA. So it will have a core of nucleic acid. It will have a capsid, something that encloses it. In other words, it sort of functions like the cell membrane does for a cell, but this is not a cell membrane. This is just I think it's, I can't remember if it's protein or lipid structure that protects the nucleic acid core. And then there's also an envelope. Then it has this part. It has to have some structure, may not look like this, but some structure that allows it to attach to a cell. Now, this one happens to attach to bacteria cells. But there can be other ways of attaching to a cell, like maybe one of your cells when you have the flu or something like that. Now, viruses are, it says, obligate intracellular parasites. What does that mean? What do those words mean? Well, what was a parasite first? We already have that. They live off of what? They live off of other living things. Okay, so these have to affect or infect living things. Intracellular means what? What do the parts mean? Obviously, the last part means cell, but what does intra mean? When you go to the hospital, they often give you an IV. What does IV stand for? Anybody know? Intravenous, and then fluid or whatever, but it means inside. So intra means inside. So here is a parasite that it does its parasitic work on the inside of a cell. You know, remember we talked about other parasites, they just work from the outside of cells. These do their work inside the cell. And then what was obligate mean? If you're obligated to do something, what does that mean? It's a lot stronger than that. You have to. Okay? They have to do their work inside the cell. They don't do any of the work outside the cell. They do all their work inside the cell. So they have to have some way of getting inside the cell. If you think about that. Now, here's an extra word added to it. Highly specific. that virus I showed you in the previous picture will only attack bacteria. It won't attack you. And it doesn't attack every kind of bacteria. Only certain bacteria does it. They're highly specific. So a viral disease that can affect humans usually doesn't affect your pets, you know, and vice versa. You know, if your pets get sick, usually you don't get the same thing they get, because the virus that causes them to get sick is not the same virus that'll make me get sick. So they're highly specific. So here's this structure again, and the name of this structure, this particular virus, is called a bacteriophage. In this picture right here, this brown part here is a bacteria, and you can see the size of these viruses compared to the bacteria. So bacteria are really small, viruses are really tiny compared to a bacteria. So we have a hard time seeing bacteria under a microscope. You need a pretty good microscope to be able to see bacteria. Well, these are starting to get about too small to be able to see with most microscopes. So we have to have an electron microscope to be able to see stuff that's that tiny. Okay? So this particular one, as I said, is a virus that infects certain bacteria. Not all bacteria, certain ones. When a virus is able to affect a cell, and pathogen is anything that's infecting another organism, we say it's virulent, or we're talking about the virulence of it. I know this. How well can it attack a cell or affect a cell? Now, all viruses kind of go through a cycle of activity to do their, like, dirty work. This activity cycle is called the lytic cycle. Lytic cycle. Kind of related to the word lysis. Anybody remember what lysis meant? It means to split. You know, like photolysis was to split using light. We had cytolysis. Remember, that was a splitting open of a cell. Okay? So here are the kind of like the stages, or I like stages or steps. I don't know what word would work best here. But the first thing is the virus has to attach to a cell. So like, for instance, when you get the flu, that flu virus has to attack cells in your body. Okay? And it has to become attached to it in some way. Now, in the previous picture, we had the bacteriophage with look at those leg-like structures that help it attach to the bacteria. Now, once it's attached to the cell wall of the bacteria, it needs to gain entry into the cell. Not the virus itself. The virus will always stay on the outside of the cell, but what gets inside the cell is the nucleic acid gets inside the cell. So it will use some enzymes to eat away at the cell wall and cell membrane. So now there's a hole in the bacteria, and then it will release its nucleic acid into the cell. Okay, so this nucleic acid is now inside the cell. That's all that it needs to do to be able to do its dirty work, is get the nucleic acid inside the cell. Once it's inside the cell, that nucleic acid will do a couple of different things, but one of the things is it will replicate itself. Okay? Make copies of itself. And then remember, in the process of nucleic acids, to make a protein, it needed to go through transcription. And then that messenger RNA goes to the ribosomes to make a protein. Well, it needs to be able to do that. So it's going to replicate itself and transcribe that information into, like, messenger RNA that can go to the ribosomes and start doing its job. Now, this bacteria, its own nucleic acid would make things that the cell needs. You know, it's organelle and different things like that. But this new nucleic acid that's inside of here now is going to be the copy that it uses. So it's no longer going to use the bacteria's genetic information. It's going to now use the genetic information of the virus. So it's kind of like shuts down everything that the bacteria was doing and now makes all of those structures inside the bacteria. Instead of making organelle and other things that the cell needs, it's going to start now assembling new viruses from the raw materials that are inside the cell. It's just going to use up all the raw materials and make as many viruses as it can. So the whole inside here will eventually hold as many viruses as there are raw materials inside the cell to make. Then, at that point, the cell will have run out of energy and will die, and it will break open, and what will come out? All these viruses that have been assembled. And these viruses now are available to attack other cells. And I think it says in your book, from the time that it attaches to the time it pops open, it can only be maybe like 30 minutes. So you can see that it's going to quickly, the population of viruses in your body is going to go up very quickly. And this is one of the reasons, we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but this is one of the reasons why if you have a viral disease, you know, at lunchtime I felt good, you know, and by the time I was getting ready to go home, I feel rotten, you know. Viruses do that. Their effect can be really quick. So what is in that nucleic acid inside the virus? Okay, it's going to be one of two things. It's either going to be a core of regular DNA. Remember, they're a double helix, you know, that spirals around each other. And it says it uses the host enzymes to produce the RNA. So when it puts its DNA into that new cell, it's going to use the host enzymes to make the messenger RNA and the different RNAs that it needs to build new viruses. Not using the host cell's own instructions. It's just going to totally put those aside, and they're going to use these instructions. This, to me, like an analogy of this would be, let's say during wartime, and one country gets conquered by another country, and this conquering country is planning on going and attacking other countries. So what it will do is, once it gets into that country, it will then get control of all the factories that are in that country and convert them into making something else. Let's say this factory used to make cars, and now we're going to change it into a factory now that builds tanks and armored personnel carriers and different things like that they can use in waging war against the next country. So it's kind of like, that's what sort of like a virus does, is it commandeers that production process to make not what it was originally supposed to be making, not using the original blueprint, bringing its own blueprint, say, no, you're not going to make that, you're going to make this now. Okay? So this DNA is going to be incorporated into the host DNA. So in other words, the host now has kind of like two sets of DNA. The DNA of the host cell, the cell that got infected, and the DNA that came from the virus. Okay, so that's one kind. The other kind is RNA. So there's no viruses that have DNA and RNA. They either have one or the other. And the RNA is what it does instead of it in adding itself to the DNA. It says, well, we're just going to bypass the DNA altogether. We're going to just gain control of the ribosomes, the factories, and we're going to make what we want. Okay? We're just going to totally ignore what the instructions are for this factory. We're going to control the factory and make it produce what we want it to produce. Okay? Now, a retrovirus is one of those that kind of does that, and we'll talk about that here. A retrovirus actually does things sort of backwards from what cells do. Retro, have you ever heard of something being retro? You know, like looking at, like if, for instance, if you wanted to make your mom and dad wanted to make their house look retro, they'd probably make it look like color scheme, you know, different things like you would have maybe back in the 50s or 60s. You know, that's what we mean by retro, you know, going back to an older way. Okay, now what retroviruses do is they contain enzymes that are capable of doing this. This viral RNA will actually get the cell to rebuild, or not to rebuild, that's probably the wrong word, to build DNA. Now, is that the way we learned it before? Wasn't it DNA, then it got transcribed into RNA, you know, with messengers and went to the ribosomes? This is just the opposite. It's the RNA is rebuilding DNA, the big blueprint, to be incorporated in the cell's master plan. Okay? So it's going to become part of the cell's master plan. But it just came in as RNA, built DNA to be included in the chromosomes or whatever they have. So this is the opposite process. So that's not the way most living things do it. It's backwards from the way most living things do it. Now, okay, so that was viruses. Now we have a couple other structures that are the kind of mysterious type things that we don't know all that much about. There's still a lot to be learned about it. We know more about viruses than we do about these two. The first one is a viroid. It's just a really short single strand of RNA, but it's in the shape of a circle. Like right there's the shape of one circle, there's another circle. So those are viroids. Okay? So they don't have a capsule, they don't have an envelope or anything like that, don't have a means of attachment, but somehow they can infect living things, affect cells. So there's still stuff to be learned about that. Then there are prions. Okay, prions. These are just abnormal forms of a protein. So in other words, they're just protein, not all the things that we said about a virus. They're just abnormal pieces of protein. They don't contain a nucleic acid like the viruses do. But we know that, or we're pretty sure, they cause certain diseases. So there's an area that we still have to learn more about. And they say here may cause disease. It seems like they're linked, but we could be wrong. But it seems like there's a link right there. Have you ever heard of mad cow disease? Now, there was a period of time some years back where meat, I think there was like some places in Europe, I think it was England, where many of the cows had this, and so they were afraid that, will it affect humans and stuff like that, and so they just had to slaughter all these cattle and just destroy them and not allow them to go into the food. market, you know, and but so the whole name for this is bovine. You know, bovine has to do with cattle, right? And then spongiform, that kind of tells you a little bit about what it's doing to the brain. Okay, and then this has to be the brain. So it's an infection of the brain that changes the brain from its normal structure kind of into just a spongy. And the cattle don't behave normally, and they, you know, that's why they call it mad cow disease. We think this could be possibly caused by prion, but we're, you know, the sort of like the verdict is still out on that. So, you know, we've learned a lot about what causes disease. You know, we talked about like bacteria. We'll talk about some other organisms that are larger than bacteria that can cause disease. We talked about viruses, and there's still that still doesn't cover all the diseases that we know about. And you know, every year we've come across another disease that we don't know what causes it. We're trying to figure out what might be actually causing that disease. But one thing in the mad cow disease, it does destroy their central nervous system. And, you know, in their later stages, they have trouble controlling their body. They stumble around, fall down, you know. But we're just concerned that, you know, is there something, if we ate that meat, would that get into us and could it affect humans in some way? Now, we had the lytic cycle, right? That's where they attach all the way down to where they're released from the cell. Now we're going to talk about the lysogenic cycle. And the lysogenic cycle, which can eventually lead into the lytic cycle, is where a virus enters a cell and then goes into a dormant phase. And it could be there, you know, for, you know, a couple weeks, couple months, maybe even years before it becomes active. Now, in this picture, this person has we call it, common name what? Cold sore, right? A cold sore. What's happening in what's causing this, we'll give you the name here in a moment, the virus genetic material gets incorporated into the host's genetic material. So in other words, the host cells no longer have just that genetic material. It has the genetic material from the virus included in it. And it's not harming the cell in any way yet. And so as this cell goes through interphase, prophase, metaphase, telophase, it's going to produce more cells from that have this mixture of DNA, won't it? Of nuclear material. It'll have a mixture of that. So all these cells in an area are going to have this same genetic material. And then something will come along and stimulate that virus to go from latent into the lytic cycle, where it'll actually start affecting the cell. Now, those of you that have ever or heard about, I'm not saying that you have cold sores, but if you have cold sores, what often do they say kind of triggers it? You ever heard like stress can cause cold sore? You know, you just you have cold sores erupt on your lips. Well, you already had these viruses in these cells, let's say in this area right here, and but there was nothing to kind of like signal it to start doing its thing, you know, attacking the cells. And then once the stimulus starts that process, it's no longer hidden, it's now affecting the cell, and it goes into that lytic cycle, you know, like we talked about before. So the cold sore, this is the name that it goes by, herpes simplex virus. The herpes virus, there's a bunch of different kinds there, all the way from rather simple, what I would call cold sores, to at the other end are those that are part of sexually transmitted diseases, can also be in this category. Okay? That doesn't mean if you have a cold sore that that you've been involved in that kind of activity. It's just the viruses are similar, but they do different things. And they affect different cells. Remember we said they're highly specific, so only certain cells that they tend to attack. So this, you wouldn't find cold sores, on the back of your leg or something like that, because that's not the right kind of cells. They are pretty picky on what cells they attack. Now, we have some viruses that we call persistent. They release virus particles without going through that lysis, the cell splitting open that we talked about. We have some that we call transforming. This is the kind of like the one that we just talked about, would be that kind, where it adds its genetic material to the host genetic material. So the blueprint is a little bit bigger, incorporates some stuff about viruses. But as I said before, they're highly specific. So if you have a viral disease, let's say your dog has a viral disease, it's probably you're not going to get anything from that. I don't know if this was a disease caused by a virus, but I think it was, but I'm not sure. But when I was growing up, I had a friend's family. They farmed and they ranched, and so the younger calves, they would vaccinate them so they wouldn't get a disease called hoof and mouth disease. And it affected the hoof and the mouth. I don't know, obviously. And what they would do to vaccinate them is they would take the younger calves and they'd have this gun-like thing that had a needle on it, and then every time they'd pull the trigger, it would inject, like you were giving a shot. So they would grab the calf like this, bend over, and then they'd push it into their shoulder and pull the trigger, and it would put out, a little bit of vaccine into the calf. Well, my friend's older brother was doing this, but calves don't sit there wildly waiting for you to do that. They're, often just wrestling, and so you kind of have to wrestle him, and he did like this, missed the calf, and shot it in his leg. Well, that vaccine was for a disease that humans don't get. We don't get hoof and mouth disease, okay? So it's highly specific as it sits. It doesn't affect us. Now, are there some diseases that are close enough? And we'll talk about that later on when we get to like smallpox. Smallpox is really similar to cowpox. And your body can become immune to one, and that immunity helps you with the other one. So, as I said, they're pretty limited to the type of organism, even the type of cells that they can affect. They don't just affect any cell from that animal. It's only like certain cells. Think about when you have the flu, what parts of your body that it affects. It doesn't affect all parts of your body. Your toe is not affected, Your whole body feels bad, but it's not the part that's being affected, right? The one thing about viral diseases, once that virus is inside the cell, it's pretty hard to do anything to destroy that virus once it's inside the cell, because to destroy the virus would probably destroy the cell. So it's kind of hard once it's inside you. Now, one of the things that viruses do is that they do mutate. They can actually change their genetic code, and it makes it harder to track what's causing what, and it's also harder to figure out what treatment I can use for that. And it's also the reason why there are as many different viruses as there are. Now, have you noticed that? How many of you have only had the cold once in your life? Isn't anybody? Well, then why? Now, one of the things about a viral disease, when you recover from a viral disease, you're immune to that virus. So when you get a cold again, why can you get a cold again? Because it's a different cold virus. There are that many different cold viruses. I never realized that link there, except when I was teaching in Kansas City. One of my students' dad was a doctor, and he was head of the Kansas City Health Department, over the whole city. And I asked him one time when he was there for, I don't know, a parent meeting or something like that, I asked him, if we become immune to the viral disease that we've been infected with, how can I keep getting it again? He says, there's that many different flu viruses. There's that many different cold viruses. So you can have, there's as many viruses out there. You can have a cold multiple times a year for every year of your life and still probably not run out of cold viruses. There's that many different ones. And when we have flu shots, I don't know, any of you have flu shots? Yes, some of you do, some of you don't. That when they're deciding what they're going to give you a shot of, what viruses, they're picking out which ones they think, which of the different ones we know about are going to be probably most common the next year, but it's a guess on their part. Some years they're pretty good, some years they just totally miss it, because we don't know, exactly, but we're kind of guessing which ones, and hopefully it will make you at least not have the symptoms as strongly as that. Now, one of the things that I found for myself is I don't recall ever in my lifetime ever having had the flu. That's not a lot of the population are like me, but I don't remember ever having had the flu. I've had lots of colds, and maybe even strep throat and stuff like that, but not the flu. But a few years back, I read an article of what the current thinking is about flu. Is that when the flu virus goes around, everybody gets it. But not everybody has the classic symptoms of a flu. The ones where you have to throw up, you have diarrhea, you just feel really awful, achy, all those things like that. That's the way one part of the population reacts to that virus. I'm part of the population that maybe I just don't feel quite as up to par that day. Maybe a little under. I kind of say I'm feeling under the weather. I don't feel sick. I'm just not really on the top of my game that day. Okay, that's the way my body responds to that. So apparently there must be something about that virus that is trying to do certain things in my body that mine's not equipped to do, and so I can't respond in that way. So there is, think about the differences that we look at each other around the room, and we're just seeing external differences. God makes us all very unique in so many different ways. If you think about all the different ways that we can be different, there's way more differences than there are people in the world. And then the idea of mutating, it makes it hard to track. How to keep on top of how we could keep people from getting sick from different viruses, because if they change on us continually. Now, how do we control diseases like viral diseases? One of the things is you've been vaccinated. Okay? And then we also have what were called antiviral drugs. Okay? So those are the two ways. We'll talk about vaccination first. One is called an inactivated vaccine. And here we've taken a virus and we've altered it by heat or with chemicals so that it can't replicate itself. In other words, that process, you remember we said was replicate, that part doesn't work. So it doesn't mean it doesn't attack cells anymore, but it can't go through the whole process and release more viruses. Okay, it's stuck. This what kind of immunity, though, isn't what we would call the real long-term immunity. It may only last for like a year or a few years. The other one is called an attenuated vaccine, and in this one, we give you a live virus, but we've kind of tuned it down a little bit. That's what the idea of attenuated. In other words, it's still alive, and it can affect you. It can still produce the immune response in my body, but I'm not going to get the full-blown symptoms that are ordinarily associated with that virus. So this is going to give you a lot stronger immunity, might last you for many years. Now, none of these seem like last for a lifetime.